Welcome back to Midnight Affair Tales. Thank you for joining us. Her laugh was venomous, her body tangled with a man who didn't belong in my home, or my bed. Sarah's nails dug into his back, moaning his name as she pressed herself against him on the sheets I had bled for, fought for. From the shadows of the hallway, I stood motionless, watching their betrayal unfold through the hidden camera feed on my phone. But the moans weren't the only thing that burned. Their whispered words, muffled but clear enough, pierced me deeper than any bullet ever had. "We do it after the insurance clears," Derek murmured, his lips grazing her neck. "The money will set us up for life." My blood ran cold as Sarah giggled, her voice dripping with cruelty. "It's perfect. He'll never see it coming. They were planning to kill me. Me. A man who had survived war zones, ambushes and death itself. Yet they thought I'd be an easy target." As they kissed, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't just rage, it was precision. It was the part of me the military had sharpened into a weapon. This wasn't betrayal. This was treason. I stepped back into the night, the icy wind biting against my skin as my plan began to form. They didn't know it yet, but I wasn't their prey. I was the hunter. And I would make sure their last mistake was underestimating me. So dear mature audience, if you discovered a deadly betrayal like this, how far would you go for revenge? Let us know below. James hadn't always been a man of silence and shadows. Years ago he was the proud, optimistic soldier who believed his service would make the world a better place. Special Forces wasn't just a job, it was a calling, one that demanded precision, discipline, and sacrifice. Over a decade in combat zones had honed him into a machine of survival. It also left scars, visible and invisible. Sarah had been his solace in those years of chaos. They met during his first deployment break. Her radiant smile and easy laugh had pulled him out of his hardened shell. She was his light in a world of darkness, the one person who promised him a future beyond war. Or so he thought. But war changes men. James returned from his final mission with a hardened exterior, a man who spoke less and observed more. His body carried the weight of shrapnel wounds, and his mind bore the weight of decisions no man should have to make. Sarah had been patient at first, tending to his wounds, encouraging him to heal. Then the late-night arguments began. "You're not the same man I married," she'd said, her voice cold. James would sit in silence, the battlefield still echoing in his head. He didn't know how to tell her that some parts of him had died out there, leaving behind a soldier who could never truly come home. That was when the cracks appeared. The missed kisses, the sidelong glances, the excuses that turned into absences. James blamed himself for not seeing it sooner. But now, as he pieced together Sarah's betrayal, he realized that she hadn't just abandoned him, she had planned his downfall. And James? He was done being the silent man. James sat in the cold shadows of his home, the dim glow of the hidden camera feed lighting his face. He watched every touch, every kiss, every whispered lie. Derek, the so-called lover, was more than a fling. He was Sarah's partner in crime. Their words replayed in his head like a dark symphony. "We'll poison him," Derek had said, his fingers trailing down Sarah's neck. "Make it look like an accident. The payout will set us up for life." James clenched his jaw, his special forces training flooding back. He had infiltrated warlords' compounds, survived ambushes, and eliminated high-value targets in hostile territories. But this was the deepest cut. They had planned to kill him, not knowing the beast they were waking. He played the footage again, this time focusing on Sarah's face. The woman he had loved, the one who had kissed him with promises of forever, was laughing as she plotted his murder. "He's so clueless," she giggled, pulling Derek closer. "He still thinks I love him." James's fists tightened, his nails digging into his palms. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was a war declaration. If they wanted to play with fire, he would bring an inferno. Sliding open a hidden drawer, James pulled out a box containing his tools of war. A combat knife, an encrypted phone, and a USB drive filled with surveillance data. This wasn't about survival anymore. This was about erasing the betrayal in a way they would never forget. The next morning, James began his mission with precision. He didn't confront them outright, that would be too easy. Revenge wasn't about anger, it was about strategy. He started by cutting Sarah's access to his accounts, but subtly. Her credit card declined at lunch, and James feigned concern. "That's strange. I'll call the bank," he lied, his voice calm. Next came the surveillance. He followed Derek to his shabby apartment, observing every move. Derek thought he was untouchable, smug in his belief that James was oblivious. Little did he know James was preparing to dismantle his life piece by piece. That night, as Sarah slept beside him, James hacked into Derek's phone using skills the military had taught him. He found messages, photos, and bank transactions that painted a clear picture of their affair and the murder plot. But it wasn't enough to have evidence. James wanted them to suffer. The first strike came the following day. Derek's car alarm blared incessantly, draining his battery. Inside, James had left a single note on the dashboard: "You're being watched." By evening, Derek was already spiraling. "Someone's following me," he told Sarah over a hushed phone call. "I think it's him." "Don't be ridiculous," Sarah replied, but her voice wavered. James smiled in the shadows, listening to their panic. This was only the beginning. What's the best revenge? Confronting betrayal head-on or letting them destroy themselves? Share your thoughts below. James didn't stop at Derek's paranoia. He wanted Sarah and Derek to turn on each other. Revenge wasn't just about inflicting pain, it was about watching them destroy themselves from within. The next morning, while Sarah was in the shower, James carefully swapped her phone with a duplicate he had prepared. With access to her messages and social media accounts, he began planting subtle seeds of distrust. Derek received an anonymous message that morning: "She's using you. Once the money is hers, you'll be next." Meanwhile, Sarah's phone lit up with a similar text: "You think he loves you? He's already seeing someone else." The ripple effect was immediate. That evening, while pretending to be a loving husband, James listened from the next room as Sarah and Derek argued over the phone. "You've been acting weird," Sarah accused, her voice sharp. "Is there someone else?" Derek snapped back, his tone defensive. "Are you serious? You're the one who keeps disappearing without explanation. Maybe it's you who has someone else." James smirked, pouring himself a glass of whiskey as their relationship began to fracture. It wasn't enough to punish them physically, he wanted to dismantle their trust in one another. Later that night, Sarah curled into bed beside him, her movements stiff and awkward. She was distracted, consumed by the growing rift between her and Derek. James wrapped an arm around her, masking his satisfaction. "Everything okay?" he asked softly. She nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just tired." But James knew better. The cracks were deepening and soon their carefully constructed plan would collapse. James decided it was time to focus his efforts on Derek. The man had been the spark that ignited Sarah's betrayal, and James wanted to extinguish him completely. Using the surveillance data he had collected, James began anonymously leaking incriminating evidence to Derek's employer. Emails, photos, and fabricated receipts painted a picture of a man deeply involved in fraud. Within days, Derek was called into his manager's office and terminated on the spot. The fallout was delicious to witness. James followed Derek from his office to a nearby bar, where the man drank himself into a stupor. As Derek stumbled out, James stepped from the shadows, his face hidden by a baseball cap. "Rough day?" James asked, his voice calm but icy. Derek froze, his bloodshot eyes narrowing. "Who the hell are you?" James smirked, leaning in just enough for his words to pierce. "The man you'll wish you'd never crossed." Before Derek could respond, James slipped away into the night, leaving him shaken and paranoid. By the time Derek called Sarah that evening, he was a mess. "Something's wrong," he muttered, his voice trembling. "Someone's after me." "You're being paranoid," Sarah snapped, though her own voice wavered. James smiled in the darkness of his study, his plan unfolding perfectly. The next phase was already in motion, and Derek's collapse was only the beginning. Derek woke up to find his car missing. He stumbled outside his apartment, his head pounding from the night before, and all that remained was a crude message spray-painted on the pavement: "You're next." As he frantically called the police, James was already watching from a distance, his military-grade binoculars fixed on Derek's every panicked move. The car wasn't stolen, it was parked 3 blocks away, but Derek didn't know that. James didn't stop there. That evening, Derek received a package at his door, containing photos of Sarah in compromising positions with yet another man. The photos were fake, expertly doctored by James. Alongside them was a note: "Do you really think you're her only one?" Derek's mind spiraled into chaos. By the time Sarah called him that night, he was already unraveling. "You lied to me," he shouted over the phone. "Who the fuck is this other guy?" Sarah, caught off guard, snapped back, "What the hell are you talking about? Are you drunk again?" James sipped his whiskey as their argument escalated. Every word, every accusation, was a carefully calculated step toward their destruction. He wanted Derek to feel the paranoia, the betrayal, the helplessness that James had once felt. By midnight, Derek was pounding on Sarah's door, his voice slurred and angry. "You're playing me? I fucking know it." Sarah opened the door, her face a mix of rage and confusion. "You're insane. Get out of here before I call the cops." James watched from the shadows, his heart cold as ice. He had seen men like Derek break under pressure before, and he knew it wouldn't be long before he completely unraveled. Sarah thought she was untouchable, her lies hidden behind layers of deceit. But James knew where to hit her hardest. The next morning she woke up to find her bank accounts frozen. Confused and panicked, she called the bank, only to learn that every joint account with James had been emptied. "What the fuck?" she whispered, her voice trembling as she stared at her phone. James, sitting across the breakfast table, raised an eyebrow. "Something wrong, love?" She forced a smile, masking her fear. "Just a bank error, I think. I'll get it sorted." But James wasn't done. He had sent anonymous emails to Sarah's closest friends, detailing her affair with Derek. The emails included photos, carefully edited from his surveillance footage, showing her entering Derek's apartment late at night. By the afternoon, Sarah's phone was buzzing non-stop. Friends called her, furious and disgusted. Some simply stopped responding altogether. Her carefully crafted image was crumbling before her eyes. "What's going on?" James asked innocently as she paced the living room, her face pale and her hands shaking. "Nothing," she snapped, her voice sharp. "Just work stuff." James leaned back, a satisfied smirk playing on his lips. He had barely begun, and already Sarah was teetering on the edge. Revenge wasn't just about pain, it was about dismantling her piece by piece until there was nothing left. As she stormed off to the bedroom, slamming the door behind her, James opened his laptop, preparing the next phase. Sarah had underestimated him, and now she would face the full extent of what he was capable of. Derek sat in his dimly lit apartment, clutching a bottle of whiskey as his paranoia consumed him. His phone buzzed incessantly with cryptic texts. "You'll never escape me." He threw the phone against the wall, the screen shattering on impact, his breath coming in ragged gasps. James had meticulously crafted Derek's downfall, each move calculated to destroy his spirit. That night, as Derek stumbled drunkenly out of his apartment, James was waiting. In the alley behind Derek's building, James struck with the precision of a trained killer. He stepped out of the shadows, slamming Derek against the brick wall with brute force. Derek's head snapped back, his face pale with terror. "You thought you could fuck my wife and walk away?" James growled, his voice cold and venomous. "You thought you could plot to kill me?" Derek stammered, I didn't mean for it to." Before he could finish, James drove his fist into Derek's gut, knocking the wind out of him. Derek crumpled to the ground, coughing and gasping. "You're pathetic," James hissed, towering over him. "A parasite feeding off what others built. You don't deserve mercy." James grabbed Derek by the collar, pulling him close. "You're going to disappear. Leave this city, leave her, or I'll make you vanish in a way that no one will ever find you." Derek nodded frantically, tears streaming down his face. James dropped him to the ground and stepped back, his expression cold. "Next time I won't be so generous." As James walked away, Derek lay broken in the alley, his body trembling with fear. James wasn't finished with Sarah. He wanted her lies laid bare for the world to see. That evening he hacked into her social media, posting incriminating photos and videos of her and Derek, along with a caption that read, "Betrayal has consequences." The backlash was immediate. Friends, family, and colleagues flooded her inbox with messages of disgust and outrage. By morning, Sarah was a pariah, her reputation in ruins. She stormed into the kitchen, her face twisted in fury. "Did you do this?" she screamed at James, slamming her phone on the counter. James sipped his coffee, his expression calm. "Do what, Sarah? Tell the truth?" Her hands trembled as she pointed at the screen. "You're trying to ruin me?" James stood, towering over her. "No, Sarah. You ruined yourself the moment you betrayed me. I'm just making sure everyone knows who you really are." Her face crumpled as she sank to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. But James felt nothing. This was only the beginning of her punishment. Sarah sat in the living room, her face buried in her hands as the world she had built on lies crumbled around her. The photos, the videos, the whispers from friends and family, it was all too much. She felt exposed, humiliated, and trapped. But what she didn't know was that James wasn't done yet. That evening, James prepared for the next phase of his revenge. He waited until Sarah had fallen asleep, her tear-streaked face resting against the pillow. Quietly he accessed her phone, sending a message to Derek from her number. "It's over. You were nothing more than a distraction." The message hit Derek like a sledgehammer. Drunk and enraged, he stormed to the house, banging on the front door in the middle of the night. "Sarah, open the fucking door." Sarah bolted awake, panic flooding her face as James sat up beside her, feigning confusion. "What's going on?" he asked calmly. Before she could answer, Derek's voice roared from outside. "You used me. You fucking bitch, open this door before I break it down." James smirked inwardly as Sarah scrambled out of bed, running to the door. She opened it just a crack, trying to calm Derek down, but he shoved his way inside, his eyes wild with fury. "You think you can just throw me away?" he shouted, grabbing her by the arm. James appeared in the hallway, his expression cold. "I think it's time you left," he said, his voice steady but deadly. Derek turned to face him, his bravado faltering. "This isn't your business, old man." James stepped forward, his military precision evident in every movement. "It became my business the moment you fucked my wife." Before Derek could react, James grabbed him by the collar and slammed him against the wall, his voice a low growl. "Get out. Now. Or I'll show you what real pain feels like." The next morning, Sarah sat across from James at the breakfast table, her face pale and drawn. She hadn't slept, the events of the night before replaying in her mind. She finally broke the silence, her voice trembling. "James, please, we need to talk." James didn't look up from his coffee. "About what? How you plotted to kill me? Or how you fucked that loser in my bed?" Her face crumpled as tears spilled down her cheeks. "I was wrong, okay? I made a mistake. But I didn't mean for it to go this far." James laughed bitterly, the sound void of humor. "A mistake? Sleeping with him wasn't a mistake, Sarah. It was a choice. Plotting to kill me was a choice. And now you're living with the consequences of those choices." She reached across the table, her hand trembling. "I'll do anything to fix this. Please, James. I still love you." His gaze finally met hers, cold and unyielding. "Love? You don't even know what that word means. You threw away everything we had for a man who couldn't even protect you from me." Sarah fell to her knees, sobbing. "I'll leave him. I'll do whatever you want. Just, please don't destroy me." James leaned down, his voice a whisper that sent chills down her spine. "You already destroyed yourself, Sarah. I'm just finishing the job." As he walked away, leaving her broken and begging on the floor, James felt nothing but satisfaction. Derek was spiraling out of control, his paranoia now a full-blown obsession. He hadn't slept in days, every shadow and sound outside his window making him jump. He knew James was watching him, he could feel it. And yet he couldn't leave. Sarah was his ticket to survival, even if their relationship had turned into ashes. That evening as he paced his apartment, a knock on the door startled him. He froze, his breath shallow before creeping toward the peephole. Nobody was there. Cautiously he opened the door and looked down. A small package wrapped in brown paper lay on the floor. With trembling hands he picked it up and tore it open. Inside was a USB drive and a single note. "Watch this if you want to understand what you're dealing with." Derek plugged the USB into his laptop. What he saw made his blood run cold. Footage of James in combat zones, silent, calculated, and deadly. Clips of him dismantling armed men with nothing more than his bare hands. Derek's face paled as the realization set in. He wasn't dealing with an angry husband. He was dealing with a trained killer. The video ended with James looking directly into the camera, his voice calm yet chilling. "This is who I am. Leave while you still can." Derek slammed the laptop shut, his heart racing. He grabbed his phone and dialed Sarah, his voice frantic. "You didn't tell me who your husband really is." "He's going to kill us, Sarah." Sarah, her own life in shambles, snapped back. "What the fuck do you want me to do, Derek? I'm barely holding on myself." Derek hung up, his hands shaking. For the first time in his life he realized he wasn't the predator, he was the prey. While Derek drowned in his paranoia, James turned his attention back to Sarah. He wanted her to feel the sting of betrayal, the shame of exposure. The perfect wife, the socialite who had played her role so well, was about to be unmasked. That evening, Sarah attended a charity gala, a last desperate attempt to hold onto the facade of her life. Dressed in an elegant gown, she forced a smile as she mingled with the elite crowd. But James had already set his plan in motion. Midway through the event, the lights dimmed, and a video began playing on the large projector screen. At first, it seemed like a tribute to military families, with patriotic music and images of soldiers in action. But then the tone shifted. Footage of Sarah and Derek appeared, their affair laid bare for all to see. The audience gasped as images of them entering hotels, kissing passionately, and exchanging texts scrolled across the screen. The final frame showed Sarah laughing as she discussed the murder plot. The room erupted in whispers and gasps. Sarah froze, her face pale, her hands trembling. "Turn it off," she screamed, but no one moved. James, standing in the corner of the room, watched as she crumbled. He didn't need to say a word. The damage was done. As the video ended, Sarah fled the room, her reputation in tatters. James followed her into the empty hallway, his voice cold and steady. "You wanted to play the game, Sarah. How does it feel to lose?" Her sobs echoed in the corridor, but James walked away, leaving her alone in the ruins of her once perfect life. Derek thought he could run, but James was always a step ahead. That night, Derek packed his bags, muttering to himself. "I need to get the fuck out of here," he said, sweat dripping from his forehead. He thought the cheap motel outside town would buy him time. It didn't. James tracked him effortlessly. His military training taught him to find men like Derek, weak, desperate, and predictable. He waited until midnight, slipping into the room undetected. Derek jolted awake to the sound of something heavy hitting the floor. His suitcase was open, its contents spilled across the carpet. "Going somewhere?" James's voice was a low, menacing growl, coming from the dark corner of the room. Derek's heart stopped. Look man, I didn't mean." James stepped into the dim light, his face devoid of emotion. "Didn't mean what? Fuck my wife? Plan my murder? Lie to yourself thinking you were untouchable?" He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You're not untouchable, Derek. You're a fucking parasite." Before Derek could respond, James slammed him against the wall, his forearm pressing into his throat. "You took what's mine. You thought I wouldn't notice? That I wouldn't care?" I'm sorry." Derek choked, clawing at James's arm. James's grip tightened. "Sorry doesn't cut it." He released Derek, letting him fall to the floor, gasping for air. Then James tossed a black duffel bag onto the bed. "Inside that bag are photos, evidence, and a fucking letter addressed to the police. It tells them exactly what you and Sarah planned. Leave this city by morning or I hand it all over. Your choice." Derek nodded frantically, tears streaming down his face. "I'll go. I swear." James smirked coldly. "Good. Because next time I won't be this kind." While Derek scrambled to escape, Sarah sat in the wreckage of her life. Her phone buzzed incessantly, calls from work, friends, and even her family. She ignored them all, staring blankly at the empty wine glass in her hand. James entered the room, his presence suffocating. He stood silently, watching her, waiting for her to speak. Finally, she broke the silence. "What do you want from me?" Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "What I want, Sarah?" James repeated, his tone sharp. "I wanted loyalty. I wanted a wife who didn't fuck another man in my bed." He took a step closer, his voice growing colder. "But now, I want you to feel what I felt. Helpless. Destroyed. Nothing." She looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. "I know I hurt you. I know I was wrong. But please, I'll do anything to fix this." James laughed bitterly, the sound cutting through her like a blade. "Fix it? You think this can be fixed?" He crouched down, his face inches from hers. "You killed what we had the moment you spread your legs for Derek." Sarah sobbed, reaching for him, but he slapped her hand away. "Don't fucking touch me," he snarled. "You're not my wife anymore. You're just pathetic." He stood and turned to leave, pausing at the door. "Oh, and Sarah? I've sent the video of you and Derek to your boss. Let's see how loyal they are to you after this." Her screams echoed as James walked out, his heart as cold as the night. James waited for the perfect moment to execute the next phase of his revenge. It wasn't enough to destroy Sarah's reputation. He needed her to feel the physical, visceral consequences of her betrayal. That night, he returned to the house where they had shared a life, where her lies had festered like a disease. Sarah was in the kitchen, pouring herself another glass of wine, her eyes swollen from days of crying. She didn't hear him enter. The sound of the door slamming startled her, and she spun around, spilling the wine across the marble countertop. "James," she started, her voice shaking, but he cut her off with a glare so cold it made her step back. "Don't say my name," he growled, his voice low and venomous. "You don't get to speak to me like nothing's happened. Not after what you've done." She tried to compose herself, her hands trembling as she set the glass down. "I've told you I'm sorry. I've begged for your forgiveness. What else do you want from me?" James stepped closer, his movements calculated and deliberate. "You think sorry erases the nights I laid in bed wondering why I wasn't enough for you? You think sorry fixes the fact that you plotted to kill me?" Her face went pale, her lips trembling. "I never meant." "Don't fucking lie to me," he roared, slamming his fist on the counter. The sound echoed through the room, making her flinch. "You meant every word. Every moan. Every fucking plan you made with him." Tears streamed down her face as she sank to the floor, her body shaking with sobs. James loomed over her, his voice cold and steady. "This is only the beginning, Sarah. You don't get to break me and walk away. I'll make sure you never forget what you did." Derek thought he could disappear. He thought James's warning was the end. But James wasn't a man who left loose ends. Derek's cowardice had earned him a special kind of punishment. James tracked Derek to a dingy motel on the outskirts of town. The place reeked of desperation, its flickering neon sign casting eerie shadows across the parking lot. James waited until the dead of night, slipping into Derek's room with the silent precision of a predator. Derek was passed out on the bed, the stench of alcohol filling the room. James stood over him, his expression cold and unyielding. Without a word, he grabbed Derek by the collar and yanked him out of bed, slamming him against the wall. Derek woke with a gasp, his eyes wide with terror. What the fuck?" he stammered, his voice shaking. "You thought you could run from me?" James snarled, his grip tightening. "You thought I wouldn't find you?" Derek struggled, his hands clawing at James's iron grip. "Please, I'll leave. I'll go anywhere you want." James leaned in, his voice a deadly whisper. "You don't get to decide where you go. I do. And I've decided you'll spend the rest of your pathetic life looking over your shoulder, wondering when I'll come for you again." He released Derek, letting him fall to the floor in a heap. James crouched down, his voice calm but chilling. "Remember this, you're still breathing because I want you to be. But if I ever see you again, that will change." Derek nodded frantically, his face pale as he scrambled to his feet. James stood, watching as Derek fled into the night, his shadow disappearing into the darkness. James wasn't satisfied with Derek running off into the night. He wanted to ensure that both Sarah and Derek would never recover from their betrayal. The next step in his plan involved Sarah's most vulnerable point, her desperate need to salvage what little dignity she had left. Sarah sat in her bedroom, staring at her phone. The messages from friends had stopped. The invitations had dried up. She was alone, abandoned by the world she had once controlled. But James had left her one thread of hope. A fake anonymous email claiming to be from someone who could fix her situation. The email read, "I know what you've done. If you want to save yourself, meet me tomorrow at the cafe on 5th Street. Come alone." Desperate and clinging to any chance of redemption, Sarah arrived at the cafe the next morning, her face hidden behind oversized sunglasses. She sat nervously, her hands clutching a cup of coffee she couldn't bring herself to drink. James watched from across the street, his eyes cold. He had hired a private investigator to approach Sarah, posing as the anonymous source. The man sat across from her, sliding a folder onto the table. Inside were photos, some real, some doctored, of Sarah and Derek, their affair laid bare in brutal clarity. But there was more. Fabricated evidence of Sarah siphoning money from James's accounts, falsified documents tying her to Derek's other crimes. Sarah's face drained of color as she flipped through the pages. This isn't true," she whispered, her voice trembling. The investigator leaned in, his voice calm but menacing. Doesn't matter. The courts won't know that. Unless, of course, you're willing to pay. Sarah's hands shook as she realized the noose tightening around her neck. James smirked from the shadows. The trap was set and Sarah was walking right into it. Derek thought he had escaped James's wrath, but James wasn't finished with him yet. Late one night, Derek stumbled into the dingy motel he was hiding in, the weight of his fear crushing him. He locked the door, bolted the windows, and sat on the edge of the bed, clutching a half-empty bottle of whiskey. The room was silent, save for the hum of the neon sign outside. But then a sound broke the stillness, a faint click like a door handle turning. Derek froze, his breath hitching. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling. The silence returned, but Derek's paranoia was now fully ignited. He grabbed a knife from the kitchenette, his hands shaking as he moved toward the door. Out of nowhere, the lights flickered and then the power went out completely. Derek's heart raced as he stumbled in the darkness, his knife clutched tightly in his hand. "Show yourself," he shouted, but his voice cracked with fear. A sudden noise, heavy footsteps, echoed behind him. Derek spun around, slashing blindly, but his blade met only air. Then a voice, calm and chilling, came from the darkness. "You think I forgot about you, Derek?" Derek dropped the knife, his knees buckling as James stepped into the faint glow of the moonlight streaming through the window. "Please," Derek begged, his voice a desperate whisper. "I'll leave. I'll disappear. Just don't." James interrupted, his voice cold and unyielding. "You already had that chance. Now you'll learn what it means to fear." What happened next was swift, brutal, and calculated. James didn't kill Derek, he didn't need to. By the time he was done, Derek was left a trembling, broken man, begging for a mercy that James had no intention of granting. Sarah sat alone in the dimly lit living room, the silence pressing down on her like a suffocating blanket. Her once pristine life had become a nightmare she couldn't escape. Her reputation was destroyed, Derek was gone, and James had turned into a man she no longer recognized, a force of vengeance she couldn't outrun. Her phone buzzed. She hesitated before picking it up, her hands trembling. The message was from an unknown number. "You've lost everything and it's only going to get worse." She dropped the phone, her heart pounding. Tears streamed down her face as she curled up on the couch, clutching her knees to her chest. But the night wasn't going to offer her any solace. The front door creaked open and her head snapped up. James stepped inside, his expression unreadable, his presence dominating the room. "You look like shit," he said flatly, his voice devoid of emotion. Sarah wiped her face, trying to compose herself. "James, please, we need to talk." "I can't do this anymore." James chuckled darkly, his laugh hollow. "You can't do this? You. The woman who fucked another man in my bed and plotted to kill me? You don't get to say when this ends, Sarah." "I do." She stood, her legs shaking. "I made a mistake. I know I did. But I don't deserve this." "Deserve?" James interrupted, stepping closer. "You don't get to talk about what you deserve. You made your bed, Sarah. Now you get to lie in it. Alone." Her sobs filled the room, but James didn't care. He walked past her, heading upstairs without another word, leaving her to drown in her despair. James wasn't satisfied with just breaking Derek in private. He wanted everyone to see the man for what he was, a coward and a traitor. Using the evidence he'd gathered, James sent an anonymous tip to a local journalist about Derek's affair with Sarah and their plan to kill him. Within hours, the story was plastered across every news outlet in town. The headlines were brutal: "Exposed, cheating wife and her lover's murder plot against decorated veteran." Derek, holed up in a cheap motel, saw the news on the TV in the lobby. His face appeared on the screen alongside Sarah's, their actions detailed for the world to judge. He froze, his drink slipping from his hand and shattering on the floor. "You've got some nerve showing your face here," the motel clerk sneered, recognizing him from the news. Derek backed away, his hands raised defensively. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this. It's not what it looks like." The clerk scoffed. "Get the fuck out of here. People like you don't belong anywhere." As Derek fled the motel, the weight of public scorn crushed him. Strangers whispered and pointed, their judgment palpable. James watched from a distance, satisfied. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about making sure Derek and Sarah were left with nothing. James wasn't done yet. He knew that breaking Sarah physically wasn't enough. She needed to feel the crushing weight of guilt and betrayal in every moment of her life. He decided to invade the one place she still thought was safe, her mind. It started subtly. She woke up one morning to find a note on the bathroom mirror written in lipstick. Was it worth it? She stared at it, her heart pounding, her breath shallow. She tried to convince herself it was her imagination, but the cracks in her psyche were widening. The next night she heard whispers coming from the hallway. Soft, menacing, and unmistakably familiar. I trusted you. She ran out of her bedroom, her feet bare against the cold hardwood floor, but the hallway was empty. James? Is that you? She called out, her voice trembling. James appeared behind her, his face calm but his eyes cold. What are you talking about? He asked casually, his tone dripping with mock innocence. I thought I heard something, she stammered, her voice barely audible. He leaned in, his lips close to her ear. Maybe it's your conscience, Sarah. Maybe it's finally catching up with you. Her body trembled as she backed away from him, but there was nowhere to run. James's presence was suffocating, his words cutting deeper than any blade. Every time you close your eyes, I want you to remember what you've done, he said, his voice low and venomous. Every time you breathe, I want you to feel the weight of your choices crushing you. Sarah collapsed to the floor, her sobs echoing through the empty house. James watched her, his face expressionless. He didn't need to touch her to hurt her anymore. Her own guilt was the weapon he wielded now. Derek had become a ghost of himself, his once cocky demeanor replaced by fear and desperation. He'd fled to a new city hoping to escape James's wrath, but James wasn't the kind of man to let loose ends go untied. One evening, as Derek walked into a dimly lit bar, he noticed the bartender eyeing him suspiciously. He ordered a drink, trying to blend in, but the whispers around him grew louder. That's the guy, someone muttered. Yeah, the one who tried to kill that veteran, another voice replied. Derek's hands shook as he gripped his glass. He looked up at the TV mounted on the wall and his heart sank. There he was, his face plastered across the screen, the words cheater and murder plotter exposed, scrolling across the bottom. Before he could react, a man approached him, his face hard and unforgiving. You've got a lot of fucking nerve showing your face here, the man growled. I don't want any trouble, Derek stammered, backing away. The man grabbed him by the collar, slamming him against the bar. You already caused trouble, asshole. People like you don't deserve to breathe the same air as the rest of us. The bartender intervened, throwing Derek out onto the street. As he stumbled into the alley, clutching his aching ribs, a shadow emerged from the darkness. Enjoying yourself, Derek? James's voice was calm, but his presence was terrifying. Please? I'm done. I'm out. I'm not a threat to you anymore, Derek begged, falling to his knees. James crouched down, his face inches from Derek's. You were never a threat. Just a pest. And pests need to be exterminated. He left Derek there, broken and humiliated, knowing the man would never recover from the hell James had unleashed on him. Sarah's world had become a prison and James held the key. She sat in the dim light of the living room, her phone clutched in her hand, but every call went unanswered. Friends had abandoned her, family refused to speak to her, and Derek's number had been disconnected. She was alone, and James wanted her to feel every second of it. That night, as Sarah lay in bed, she heard the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway. Her heart raced as she sat up, clutching the blanket. James? She called out, her voice trembling. No response. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Sarah got out of bed, her hands shaking as she opened the door to the darkened hallway. The air was thick, heavy with tension. James, if this is some kind of sick joke, stop it, she shouted, but her voice cracked under the weight of her fear. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was James. He stood there, his face unreadable, his eyes cold and unrelenting. What do you want from me? Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. James stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. I want you to understand what it feels like to lose everything. To have nothing but your own guilt for company. Tears streamed down her face as she fell to her knees. I can't take this anymore. Please, James. I'm begging you. He crouched down, his face inches from hers. Begging doesn't erase the past, Sarah. It doesn't bring back the trust you destroyed. You made your choices and now you live with them. He stood and walked away, leaving her sobbing on the cold floor. Derek thought he could outsmart James, but that was his greatest mistake. Desperate to escape the nightmare James had created, Derek made the fatal decision to return to the city. He planned to confront Sarah, to demand answers and salvage whatever was left of his life. Under the cover of night, Derek snuck into the neighborhood, his face hidden under a hoodie. He made his way to the house, the same house where his betrayal had begun. But as he approached the front door, he felt a sharp, cold edge press against his throat. Looking for something? James's voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried the weight of death. Derek froze, his hands trembling. James. I wasn't. Save it, James interrupted, his grip on the knife unwavering. You had your chance to run and you blew it? Derek tried to plead, his voice shaking. I didn't come here to cause trouble. James slammed him against the wall, the knife pressing harder. You came here because you're a coward. You can't survive out there, so you came crawling back to the scene of your crime. Do you even realize how pathetic you are? Derek's knees buckled as James pulled him close, his voice cold and menacing. If I ever see your face again, I won't stop at warnings. You'll disappear, Derek. Permanently. James released him, watching as Derek stumbled away, his body trembling with fear. This time, James knew he wouldn't return. Sarah sat in the living room, staring at a single envelope James had left on the coffee table. Her name was scrawled on the front in bold, sharp letters. She hesitated, her hands trembling before finally tearing it open. Inside were photos she hadn't seen before. Intimate moments of her and Derek, taken from angles that made it clear James had been watching them for months. Her stomach turned as she flipped through the images, each one a dagger to her already shattered soul. But it wasn't just the photos, there were documents as well. Divorce papers, finalized and signed. Bank statements showing her accounts drained. A deed transfer showing the house was now solely in James's name. She clutched the papers to her chest, her breathing shallow as James walked in, his footsteps echoing ominously. What is this? She demanded, her voice cracking. James leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. It's everything you've lost, Sarah. Everything you'll never get back. Her anger flared, a desperate attempt to reclaim some sense of control. You can't just take everything from me. He stepped closer, his eyes cold and unrelenting. Everything you had was because of me. You don't get to cheat, plot my death, and walk away with a damn thing. Tears streamed down her face as she sank to the floor. I'll fight this. You can't. You'll lose, James interrupted, his voice sharp. You're not the victim here, Sarah. You're the reason this is happening. And now you get to live with it. She sobbed as he turned and walked away, leaving her to drown in the consequences of her betrayal. James had one final card to play, and it was one Derek wouldn't see coming. Using the fabricated evidence he had compiled, James leaked a dossier to the media, framing Derek not only as Sarah's lover but also as the mastermind behind their failed murder plot. The story spread like wildfire, plastered across every news outlet in the region. Derek sat in a cheap diner, staring at the television in horror as his face appeared on the screen. The words "attempted murder conspiracy exposed" scrolled across the bottom. Customers in the diner turned to look at him, their whispers growing louder. That's him, one man muttered. What a piece of shit, another added. Derek stood abruptly, knocking over his chair. It's not true, he shouted, his voice shaking. The diner owner approached, his expression hard. Get the fuck out of my place. We don't serve scum like you. Derek stormed out, his face flushed with humiliation. Outside, he pulled his phone from his pocket, dialing Sarah's number. When she didn't answer, he threw the phone against the pavement, screaming in frustration. James watched from a distance, leaning against his car, a satisfied smirk on his face. Derek's world had officially crumbled, and there was no escape. Sarah sat in the darkened house, her face pale and drawn. She had spent days trying to contact Derek, but he had vanished without a trace. Her once vibrant life had turned into a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. That evening she confronted James in the kitchen, her voice trembling. Please, James. I've lost everything. What do you want from me? He turned to face her, his expression cold. I want you to feel what I felt, Sarah. To know what it's like to lose everything you thought was yours. I already do, she sobbed, falling to her knees. I know I fucked up. I know I hurt you. But please, let me fix this. James crouched down, his face inches from hers. There's no fixing this. You're not sorry for what you did. You're sorry you got caught. She reached for his hand, but he pulled away, standing and looking down at her. You made your choices, Sarah. Now you live with them. Alone. Her sobs filled the room as James walked away, his heart cold and unyielding. James's fury had reached a point of no return. He wasn't content with simply breaking Sarah's life. He wanted her to feel the same depth of betrayal that had consumed him. That night, as the clock struck midnight, he stood in the doorway of their bedroom, watching her sleep. Her face was peaceful, almost innocent, but James saw through it. He saw the lies, the deceit, and the plans she had made with Derek. Without a word, he stepped forward, pulling a chair from the corner of the room and placing it beside the bed. Sarah stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She froze when she saw him sitting there, his expression dark and unreadable. James, she whispered, her voice shaking. What are you doing? I've been thinking, he said calmly, his tone sending chills down her spine. You think you've paid for what you've done. You think I've punished you enough. But you don't even know the meaning of pain. She sat up, her body trembling. Please, James. I've lost everything. What more can you take from me? He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. Everything you have left. Every ounce of dignity. Every shred of hope. I will take it all. Before she could respond, he pulled out a tablet showing her a video. It was footage of her and Derek, taken from angles that left no doubt about what they were doing. This, he said, his voice cold, is going to the entire neighborhood. Every friend, every family member, every acquaintance. By tomorrow morning, there won't be a single person who doesn't know exactly who you are. Her face crumpled as she grabbed his arm. No, James, please. Don't do this. He stood, pulling his arm free. You didn't care about me. You didn't care about us. Why the fuck should I care about you now? He walked out of the room, leaving her sobbing uncontrollably, knowing her life was about to be completely annihilated. Derek couldn't stay away. His life was in ruins, his name tarnished, but his anger toward James burned brighter than his fear. Armed with a desperate plan, he returned to the city, his mind clouded by rage and desperation. Breaking into James's house wasn't hard. He knew the layout from the countless nights he had spent there, pretending to be a friend while fucking Sarah behind James's back. He crept through the darkened halls, a knife clenched in his hand. But James was always one step ahead. The moment Derek entered the living room, a bright light flooded the space, blinding him. James stood there, calm and composed, holding a baseball bat. Really, Derek? James said, his voice tinged with mockery. You thought you could come into my house with that toy and take me out? Derek's confidence crumbled. You ruined my life, he shouted, his voice cracking. You've taken everything from me? James smirked, stepping closer. And you think coming here was the answer? You're even dumber than I thought. Before Derek could react, James swung the bat, connecting with Derek's arm. The knife clattered to the floor as Derek screamed in pain, clutching his now broken limb. James loomed over him, his voice low and dangerous. You took what was mine. You tried to kill me. And now you come back here? This is your final fucking mistake. Derek begged, tears streaming down his face. Please, James, don't do this. But James wasn't listening. He raised the bat again, delivering blow after blow until Derek was left a broken, sobbing heap on the floor. Get out, James growled, his voice icy. And if I ever see you again, I'll make sure you don't leave in one piece. The next morning, Sarah's worst nightmare became reality. As she opened her phone, her screen was flooded with messages, some angry, others disgusted. Her hands shook as she scrolled through the notifications, each one a nail in the coffin of her already shattered reputation. The video James had threatened to release was everywhere. Her colleagues, her friends, even her distant relatives had seen it. Her phone buzzed with a call from her mother. What is this, Sarah? Her mother demanded, her voice filled with anger and disbelief. You've disgraced this family? Sarah broke down, tears streaming down her face. I didn't mean for any of this to happen, Mom. You're not my daughter, her mother spat before hanging up. Sarah dropped the phone, her body trembling. She turned to James, who stood in the doorway, watching her with a cold detachment. You've destroyed me, she whispered, her voice hollow. No, James replied, his tone sharp. You destroyed yourself. I just made sure everyone else saw the truth. She fell to her knees, her sobs filling the room. But James felt no pity, no remorse. This was what she had earned, and he wasn't done yet. James knew his revenge wouldn't be complete until Derek was fully eradicated, not just from his life but from existence itself. Derek had returned to the city against all warnings, proving that fear alone wasn't enough to keep him away. James decided it was time to send an unmistakable, brutal message. Derek hid in a decrepit motel on the outskirts of the city, pacing the filthy room as paranoia consumed him. Every creak, every shadow outside the window made his heart race. He thought he was safe. James wouldn't dare find him here, right? But James had already tracked him down. It was 3 a.m. when Derek woke to the sound of heavy boots outside his door. Before he could react, the door was kicked open with a deafening crash. Derek scrambled out of bed, his breath hitching as James stepped into the room, a crowbar glinting in his hand. "You just don't learn, do you?" James growled, his voice dripping with menace. Derek stumbled backward, raising his hands defensively. "James, please, I didn't." "Save it," James snapped, cutting him off. "You had every chance to leave, to stay gone. But no, you had to come back. So now you deal with me." Before Derek could plead further, James swung the crowbar with merciless precision, smashing it against Derek's kneecap. The sickening crack echoed through the room as Derek collapsed, screaming in agony. "You thought you could fuck with me? Plot to kill me?" James hissed, towering over him. "This is what happens when you cross the wrong man." He didn't stop. Blow after blow landed on Derek's body, each one calculated to inflict maximum pain without killing him. Blood splattered across the walls, mixing with Derek's cries for mercy. Finally, James crouched down, grabbing Derek's bloodied face. "This is your last warning. If you ever show your face again, you won't leave alive." He dropped the crowbar and walked out, leaving Derek broken, bleeding, and terrified. Sarah's humiliation wasn't over. James had one final devastating act planned to ensure she could never recover. Using his network of contacts, he arranged for a live-streamed interview with a popular local journalist, one who was known for exposing scandals. The journalist had been fed all the damning evidence: Sarah's affair, the murder plot, and the destruction she and Derek had tried to inflict on James. The public was hungry for blood, and Sarah was about to be served on a silver platter. Sarah sat under harsh studio lights, her face pale and drawn. The journalist didn't waste time. "Sarah, the public wants to know, how could you betray a man like James? A decorated veteran, a man who provided everything for you?" Sarah stammered, her voice trembling. I made mistakes. I wasn't thinking clearly." The journalist pressed on, relentless. "Mistakes? You plotted to kill him. You slept with another man in his bed. How do you justify that?" Tears welled in Sarah's eyes as she tried to defend herself. "It wasn't like that. I was lost." James watched from behind the cameras, his arms crossed as Sarah crumbled under the pressure. The journalist continued, pulling out a folder filled with evidence. "These are the texts you sent Derek, planning James's murder. These are the photos of your affair. The public deserves to know. Do you feel any remorse?" Sarah broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. "I'm sorry," she choked out. "I'm so sorry." But the damage was done. The live audience and viewers at home saw her for what she was: a liar, a cheater, a traitor. James smirked as he walked away from the studio. The world now knew the truth, and Sarah had nothing left. James couldn't leave Derek alive. The man had proven too dangerous, too reckless. The warnings had been given, the chances exhausted. Now it was time to finish it. Under the cover of night, James tracked Derek to a rundown cabin where he had been hiding. The place was silent, surrounded by thick woods that muffled any sound. James moved with the stealth of a predator, his combat training kicking in. Inside, Derek was asleep, his body battered and broken from their last encounter. He didn't hear James enter, didn't see the knife glinting in the moonlight. James stood over him for a moment, his face expressionless. "You should have stayed gone," he muttered before plunging the knife into Derek's chest. Derek's eyes shot open, his mouth opening in a silent scream as the blade twisted. James didn't stop. He made sure every thrust counted, every movement deliberate. When it was over, Derek lay lifeless, the room stained with blood. James stood, his breathing steady, his hands steady. He wiped the knife clean and left without a trace. As he walked away, the weight of his actions didn't faze him. This wasn't just revenge, it was justice. James wasn't done. Sarah had lost her reputation, her family, and her lover, but he wanted to make sure she lost her very sense of identity. That night, he waited until the house was silent, until she was asleep in the room that once symbolized their shared dreams. James entered the room carrying a box filled with her most cherished possessions: wedding photos, personal journals, and sentimental trinkets she had kept hidden even through the chaos. He dumped them onto the floor at the foot of her bed, the loud crash startling her awake. What are you doing?" she asked, her voice thick with fear and exhaustion. James didn't answer. He struck a match, the flame flickering in the dim light, and tossed it onto the pile. The fire roared to life, consuming the artifacts of her past in a matter of seconds. "James, stop!" she screamed, lunging toward the flames. But he grabbed her arm, yanking her back with a force that made her stumble. "You don't get to save anything, Sarah," he growled, his voice as cold as steel. "This is who you are now. Nothing. A liar, a cheat, and a woman who destroyed everything she touched." She collapsed to the floor, sobbing as the fire consumed the last remnants of her former life. The heat scorched her face, the flames reflecting in her tear-filled eyes. "Do you feel it?" James said, crouching beside her. "That emptiness inside? That's what I felt the moment I found out what you'd done. Now it's your turn to live with it." He stood and walked out, leaving her alone with the smoke, the flames, and the ruins of her shattered world. James knew it was time to end things. Derek was gone, but Sarah lingered like a ghost, haunting the house with her sobs and pleas for forgiveness. She had become a shadow of the woman she once was, but James didn't care. She deserved every ounce of pain she felt. That evening he called her into the living room. She entered hesitantly, her face pale and drawn. "Sit," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. Sarah obeyed, her hands trembling in her lap. What do you want?" James stared at her for a long moment, his eyes cold and unrelenting. "I want you gone, Sarah. Out of this house, out of my life, out of everything." Her lips quivered as tears filled her eyes. "Where will I go?" "I have nothing, James." "Not my problem," he replied flatly. "You didn't think about that when you were plotting to kill me, did you? Or when you were fucking Derek?" She sobbed, shaking her head. "I was stupid. I was wrong. I know that. But please, I have nowhere else to go." James leaned forward, his voice sharp as a blade. "You had everything and you threw it away. You don't get a second chance, Sarah. You don't deserve one." He handed her a single suitcase, already packed with the few belongings he hadn't burned. "You leave tonight. If I ever see you again, I won't be so kind." Her sobs echoed as she took the suitcase and stumbled toward the door, her legs barely holding her up. As she crossed the threshold, James spoke one last time. "Goodbye, Sarah. And don't come back." Sarah wandered the cold streets, clutching the suitcase that contained what little remained of her life. She tried calling friends, but none of them answered. She tried visiting her family, but they slammed the door in her face. For days she roamed aimlessly, her once flawless appearance reduced to a disheveled wreck. Her shoes wore thin, her clothes became dirty, and her stomach ached with hunger. One evening she found herself in front of a homeless shelter. She hesitated, her pride still clinging to the last shreds of her former self. But as the cold wind bit at her skin, she realized she had no choice. Inside she was met with the harsh reality of her new life: crowded rooms, cold beds, and the judgmental stares of others who had also fallen from grace. She lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with regret and despair. She thought about James, about the life they had built together, and how she had destroyed it. She thought about Derek, the man she had chosen over her husband, and how he had brought her nothing but pain. For the first time she realized the full weight of her actions. She had made her bed, and now she was lying in it, cold, alone, and broken. James stood on the balcony of his house, sipping his whiskey as he stared out at the city lights. The home was quiet now. No more lies, no more betrayals, no more Sarah. For the first time in months his mind was clear. The journey to this point hadn't been easy. Every step of his revenge had come with its own weight, but he had carried it, knowing it was the only way to reclaim his life. Derek was gone, Sarah had been exiled, and James was finally free. He walked back inside, passing the empty bedroom where memories of love and betrayal still lingered. He stopped in front of the mirror, looking at his reflection. His face was hard, his eyes cold, but he felt a strange sense of peace. Pulling out a box from the closet, he opened it to reveal photos from their happier times. His wedding day, vacations, quiet nights at home. He stared at the images, his emotions a mix of bitterness and nostalgia. Without hesitation, he threw the photos into the fireplace, watching as the flames consumed them. "Goodbye, Sarah," he muttered, the final words he would ever say about her. As the fire burned out, James poured himself another drink. He didn't feel victorious, but he felt resolved. The chapter of his life with Sarah was over, and he was ready to start anew. Sarah's life had become a waking nightmare. She moved from shelter to shelter, struggling to find work, struggling to survive. The once proud woman who had everything was now a shadow of her former self, haunted by the choices she had made. One day, while sitting on a park bench, she spotted a family walking by, a husband, wife, and their child, laughing together as they fed the ducks. Tears filled Sarah's eyes as she realized what she had lost, what she had thrown away for a fleeting affair and a moment of selfishness. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a message from an unknown number. She hesitated before opening it, her heart sinking as she read the words, "You reap what you sow." She knew it was James. He didn't need to be near her to remind her of her choices. She would carry the weight of her guilt for the rest of her life, knowing she could never undo the damage she had caused. That night, as she lay on a thin mattress in a crowded shelter, she whispered to herself, "I'm sorry." But the words felt hollow, like an echo in an empty room. Final scene, a new beginning. James stood in his newly renovated home, the walls painted in fresh colors, the furniture carefully chosen to reflect his new life. He had started a nonprofit for veterans, using his wealth and influence to help others who had been through their own battles. A friend visited him that evening, handing him a glass of bourbon. "You seem lighter, James," the friend remarked. "I am," James replied, a small smile forming on his lips. "Sometimes you have to burn the past to build the future." As they sat together, James felt a sense of clarity he hadn't known in years. He had faced his demons, taken back control, and was finally at peace. What would you have done in James's place? Would you have forgiven Sarah and tried to rebuild, or would you have taken the path of vengeance like James? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping tales like this one.